All right, class, let's talk about this second board on imperialism, 1880s to 1914. How did imperialism open up the world and foster nationalism in Europe? The scramble for Africa. So by 1880, Europe controls all of Africa except for Liberia and Ethiopia. Belgium made a play for Congo. They made them a colony. People were treated savagely in that area, the indigenous people, and they were using the people there, typically like slaves, for the production of rubber and ivory. The British controlled Egypt as a protectorate from other European powers followed. So this was the beginning of the scramble for Africa. At the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885, scramble for Africa, no imperial power could claim a territory in Africa unless it controlled that area. So Germany hosted it, this Berlin Conference, to try to increase its imperial powers. The British Empire, British controls Egypt, and then conquered the Sudan. And the Sudan was an area that was connected to Egypt, and they took that over. The Boer Wars in southern Africa, German settlers defeat some small British army. The British then took it very seriously. The British sent a large army to defeat the settlers in the Boer Wars. At that point, then they started to control Nigeria, Kenya, Uganda, and Zanzibar, which was a huge portion of southern Africa. The French controlled Algeria from 1830 all the way up until 1960. Algeria is right across the Mediterranean Sea, so from France, so it was not very far-fetched for them to just bring their troops over and take over what they wanted to take over. They took control of Tunisia to stop raids into Algeria, which was a country that is connected to Algeria. They controlled some of Somalia, Madagascar, and eventually Morocco. Germany, Bismarck put together the Berlin Conference to ensure a piece of the action of Africa. They controlled Cameroon, Togoland, and Southwest Africa. So Berlin and Bismarck, Germany did not want to get left out of the hunt for imperial power in Africa. Italy was the last of the European powers to participate in the scramble for Africa. They controlled Eritrea, Ethiopia, and Libya in the north. Now in Asia, you had China, which was ruled by spheres of influence. You had Britain, France, Russia, Japan, Germany, all had trading region rights over China. And China didn't have too much to say about that, unfortunately for the Chinese. Also, you had the Opium Wars of 39 and 41, and then 1856 to 1860. The British, who enjoyed quite a few trading rights, especially out of Hong Kong, were trying to be pushed out by the Chinese. So the Opium Wars, the British got the Chinese hooked on opium, and once they were hooked on opium, they were forced to trade. And how they were forced to trade is that the Chinese would actually bring down gold and trade gold pound for opium, which in other words is for heroin. So once they got the Chinese hooked on opium, they would give them anything to acquire that drug, and the trade imbalance was huge at this time. But the British controlled that area. The U.S. demanded an open door to trade in China in the late 1800s, and this open door policy then allowed other people to trade in other people's regions, so spheres of influence. Now India, the British East India Company controlled all trade in India. There was the Sepoy Mutiny in 57 and 58, where Indian soldiers who were trained by the British rose up against the British, but to no avail. After 1858, India was ruled by British Parliament in London by a tiny all-white civil service in India. So you had millions of Indian people, native Indian people living in India, that were controlled by a very, very small minority British people, civil servants that were controlled by Parliament. Indian National Congress in 1888 was created, formed to train Indians to run India along British lines. And our last board, Indochina. France controls present-day Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. you know, a lot of people have heard or know about the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War was initially fought between the Vietnamese and the French to get the French out because they were a controlling interest in this area in Indochina, and then we went in after the French had left. Also controls many South Pacific islands, the French do. Response to Western imperialism. In China, they had the Boxer Rebellion in around 1900 or 1901. The Chinese uprising against imperialism. There were actual Chinese people that would, you know, hang out, and they would do like boxing matches or kung fu or whatever. These people all got together and they rebelled against the imperial powers. And there were quite a few people that were killed, a lot of Christians that were there to try to convert people. Anyone that was seen as European or American were killed until the United States actually brought in some heavy forces, the army, and put down the Boxer Rebellion. Now, Dr. Sun Yat-sen overthrows the last dynasty and tries to set up a nationalist government in China. And you know, dynasties have been going on there for thousands and thousands of years. So when he came in, he tried to westernize a lot of what was happening in China. All right, thanks.